Hi, my name's Andrew Ibrahim. I'll be talking today about writing for impact. This will hopefully be the first of many YouTube recordings of multiple talks that I'm asked to give fairly frequently, and people ask me for my slides all the time, and I send them to them, and they have follow-up questions, so I thought it'd be easier to just record the talks, have them available, and hopefully that's helpful to you on your journey. I live in 3 different worlds to just give some perspective of how I think about this topic. I'm a board-certified surgeon. I operate every Monday, clinic every Tuesday, then every 5th week I'm on call for the week for whatever comes in. I'm a formally trained health services researcher, and I help run a group here at Michigan called the Center for Healthcare Outcomes and Policy. We're a busy group. We put out well over a paper a day. We have 13 faculty who are R01 funded, and we all keep pretty busy and think a lot about how to write high-impact research articles. Before all that, I studied architecture. My research work focuses on health in the built environment. So I write for kind of a broad range of audiences, but also the design probably influences how I make these slides. We wrote kind of a playbook called Writing for Impact. It's widely downloaded, probably well over 1,000 downloads a month. That is probably how you got to this website. Someone probably sent you a screenshot of one of these slides. If you want to go to surgerydesign.com, I've posted that PDF there that's free to download. And then there's other things that are free to download there too if you want to learn how to design a hospital or how to develop early career surgeon scientist. And I'll be adding other guides there too. Feel free to do that. I want you to pause for a minute and just think about, I became a Hamilton fan when that came out. And it's not to say that I wasn't interested in U.S. history before, but I found myself thinking about it a lot more. And I hope you'll realize that the ability to use words and to use them intentionally to have impact is really a superpower. And that as you move along your journey in scientific writing, that you cultivate that superpower and be very conscious of developing it. Writing is not for the faint of heart, and I want to give you a little advice before I get into the mechanics of actually writing the paper, of just kind of managing your effort and emotions. These are some of the journals that we sometimes send our manuscripts to. And just to point out that the acceptance rates are fairly low. And so even if you write the perfect paper, you've done everything great, it's great data, great science, your chance of getting in is still pretty low. So try to manage your emotions around that. And these rates vary a little bit by article type and kind of year to year, but just kind of gives you a sense. And every paper seems to have a bit of a natural history that is somewhere on the spectrum from fun to frustration. I think when you're brainstorming a project, it's fun. Even when you write the abstract, it's still pretty fun. You're still coming up with a new idea. It's pretty exciting. People are pretty engaged into it. And then once you start getting through your initial analysis in the first draft, you start to think, this is getting like a little frustrating. There's a couple hiccups. Didn't quite work out. And then when you start to get through your first draft and your mentor really revises it and really pushes you through. I remember my first paper went through 35 drafts before it was ready to submit for the first time. I remember feeling pretty frustrated in that process, and that's sort of part of it. Then you'll submit it and you'll be pretty relieved, like this is fun again, until you hear back that either the paper was rejected. My record is 17 minutes. But hopefully yours stays out a little bit longer. But sometimes you're asked to resubmit, and then you need to go through the revisions that are asked by the journal and the reviewers, and that can be frustrating too. And then finally you get yourself to published. I would say at each of these points, when it starts to get more difficult, where you feel like you're kind of going uphill and it's getting a little frustrated, this is when your manuscript's at high risk for death. And I want you to avoid this temptation to just go back to start a new project. You will find it's very easy to start a new project and brainstorm and write an abstract, but to actually stick through and submit an article, revise it, and ultimately get it published is much more work, but that ultimately is the gratifying work. So when I look at a CV of a potential mentee or someone we're looking to hire or someone to collaborate with, and I see a lot of abstracts and not a lot of papers, I know they've fallen for this temptation. So try your best not to do that and try to stick with the project as you go. Scientific papers have an order, a convention. This isn't maybe necessarily true for every single journal, but in general, these are the 5 sections of a manuscript, and they always tend to be in this order. And I want to take you through each of them and tell you kind of what's the mechanics of each of these sections. The first is the abstract. I think I did not appreciate early in my writing how important an abstract is. We use it now in our group before we even start the paper to just brainstorm our research question. We'll write an abstract without any data or numbers and say, if these findings are positive, is that interesting? Is that worth pursuing? What if these were negative? Is that interesting pursuing too? In an ideal world, you can troubleshoot your methods and your questions enough at this point before you go down the long road of actually evaluating it. Next is once the article is submitted, the abstract is one of the first things an editor sees to determine if it's worthy for peer review. So this varies at every journal, but for many journals, especially more competitive journals, half of the articles may get weeded out just at the abstract level. So if you look at kind of these acceptance rates, maybe multiply them by 2 or 4 to get a sense of how many articles actually go out for review. Again, differs at every journal, but just gives you a sense, even just from the initial screening by an editor, many articles don't go out for review. And a key part of that is having a really well-written abstract. So spend time to really craft that and make sure that it has all the key language and points that you want it to make. And then finally, after publication, I think all of us who are writing articles want people to read them. And the first chance you get the movie trailer to get people to sign up for the movie is writing a great abstract. And this is what many people will read and decide whether or not they want to go on to read the full manuscript. Next is the introduction. We have a running joke at our center that we try not to be too prescriptive, but for an introduction, 4 paragraphs is too many and 2 is not enough. So we almost always write a 3-paragraph introduction. And I'll walk you through kind of each component of that. In the first paragraph, you just want to give context and get the reader up to speed about a topic. So a paper that I often use to teach is about critical access hospitals. Most people probably don't know what critical access hospitals are. So I need to tell you, critical access hospitals is a unique designation from the 1990s to help subsidize rural hospitals. They're under intense scrutiny because it costs a lot of money. So just quickly in that first paragraph, get the reader up to speed about the topic and why it's important. In the second paragraph, you want to create some knowledge gaps. You want to make clear what's known about the topic and what's unknown. So in critical access hospitals, gosh, we evaluated them for a lot of medical conditions. We don't know that much about them when it comes to surgical care. A common mistake here I see, especially with authors who are so enthusiastic about their topic, is they tell me about 10 knowledge gaps. They say, gosh, there's so many things we need to know about access to surgical care, about cancer disparities. That's true, I agree with you. But you only want to raise the knowledge gaps that are relevant to what you can answer in this paper. If you tell me about 10 knowledge gaps and your paper only addresses 2 of them, it kind of feels like a letdown. So try to keep your knowledge gaps tailored to just the things that are ultimately going to be in your paper. And then finally, in the third paragraph, you'll preview your plan. You'll say, now that this topic's important, we have these 2 knowledge gaps that are really big. Here's how I'm going to launch into addressing those knowledge gaps. The next section is methods. When I was a medical student, I got a chance to be at the same institution as a pretty prolific author named Dori Segev, probably one of the most published authors of our time. And he used to say that before you start writing, you should read 50 papers word for word, either in your area or by your mentor, to learn the language and conventions to describe the work accurately. And I think the number isn't as important as the actual concept, that for many of the things that we do in science, the conventions have gotten so sophisticated and are so specific to your line of work that you really need to read a lot of articles in that space to learn what's the language they're using, how are they describing that model, how are they talking about payments versus costs versus charges. And so in our data, I do a lot of Medicare claims data, so a lot of large data sets. Most of our papers are written in these section, in the methods, the data source, the cohort, the outcomes, and then your analytic plan. And if you read through a lot of our papers, they all start to sound pretty similar, And that's on purpose because we're following the conventions of what we did previously. And so when you're starting to write this section for the first time, you want to look at other papers who described similar methods, similar data sources to understand, okay, they used the years of the data and what the name of the file was. That seems to be a convention across all of them. I want to make sure I do that here. They said, here are the codes that we use to identify the cohort in the second section. I'm going to try to follow that. In Medicare, it's interesting, I get asked to review Medicare manuscripts all the time. Amongst people who do a lot of work in Medicare, it's always Medicare payments. It's not charges and it's not cost. And there's a big difference between those words. And so you'll start to notice these conventions. And if you don't pick up on them and you start talking about Medicare charges or Medicare costs, reviewers who know Medicare data will be like, something's not quite right here because this person doesn't quite seem to know a lot of the conventions. So spend your time on the methods to really learn the conventions of your peers and what's in that space. Next is the results section. I remember this book from medical school, which probably tells you that I'm getting old because it came with a free CD-ROM. But the point of this book that I remember so vividly was that when you're doing a physical exam, you just want to describe what you see, and you don't really interpret it until your assessment and plan. And I think that's a beautiful description for what you're trying to do in the results section of a manuscript. So for example, you don't want to say in the results section, much to our surprise, the results shockingly demonstrated no difference between group A and B. Because at this point, you're just supposed to be observing. And if you start to introduce much to your surprise, it starts to tell the reader that maybe you had a preconceived idea of where this was going, and maybe you weren't as objective of a scientist as they hoped you would be answering this question. A better way to make that same comment would be to say, there is no difference in outcome X between groups A and B, and then show the percentages and maybe reference the table. In our manuscripts, this isn't true for all of them, but for a lot of the papers that we write, we have these 4 sections of patient characteristics, hospital characteristics, primary and secondary outcomes, and we almost always do them in this order. And I mention that because we often, in many of our abstracts, many of our papers, other ways we talk about our work, we often talk about things in this order as well. Tell me who the patients are. Tell me where they got care. Tell me about the primary outcome. Tell me about the secondary ones. And we try to hold on to that structure throughout the manuscript to keep it consistent, or what many people refer to as parallel writing. So you'll see that in the first paragraph of the results, we talk about patient characteristics, and that's table 1. In the second paragraph, we talk about hospital characteristics, and that's table 2. And third, clinical outcomes, and that's table 3. You won't be surprised that the fourth paragraph is about payments, and you bet, yep, that's right, that's table 4. So having parallel structure makes it a lot easier for your readers to follow along and to keep that consistent throughout the paper. All right, now you're in the home stretch. You get to finally talk about the discussion. So if you pause for a minute and just reflect, if somebody's reading this article straight through, this may already be at a couple thousand words. You've summarized the abstract, you've written an introduction to get them up to speed and create knowledge gaps, you've walked them through these methodologic details and all these conventions that you are adhering to in your work, and then you're walking them through all these results. At this point, you almost need to take a breather. In the first paragraph of the discussion, you just want to plainly summarize the key findings of the paper. We try to keep it to 2 or 3 key findings. If it's more than that, it's kind of hard to follow. And just say, this study was designed to evaluate critical access hospitals and surgical care, and it has 2 principal findings. First, clinical outcomes were safe at these hospitals. Second, payments were also the same or lower than non-critical access hospitals. Taken together, these findings suggest that we should continue to support critical access hospitals. Just a nice, tight, succinct summary. I'll tell you as a reviewer, sometimes when I'm reading an article and I'm having trouble following what's going on, I jump to this paragraph to say, what does the author really want to tell me? What are their 2 key take-home points? And then it sometimes helps me get more clarity to go back to it. In the next 2 paragraphs, you want to start to put the findings of your work into context by summarizing it in the context of other manuscripts. So if other people have written about critical access hospitals, You want to say prior work has evaluated quality of care at critical access hospitals, and then summarize those 2 or 3 big studies. And then what you want to do after that is add your work. If you just said, we just found the same thing that they did, people will say, well, why'd you do the study? So you want to say something more like, our present study extends those findings, contradicts those findings, builds further on those findings to better identify X, Y, or Z. So you want to make sure you make clear why your paper is moving things beyond what's already there. I also want to say that this is an area that many editors read to try to find reviewers for your article. So if I want to find an expert in a topic, I kind of want to see who else has written on this topic. So try to be mindful about how you are describing the work of other people. You probably don't want to be too dismissive to say this totally inappropriate and poorly designed study. You could just say early work in this space raised concern about this topic, so we built on it and explored it further. After you do that for a couple paragraphs, you now want to recognize limitations of your manuscript. There's no manuscript without limitations, and you need to be able to say, as great as this study is, as much hard work as we put into it, as much as we did all the things that we could, there's some limitations that really inform the context of all of our findings. And what you want to do is not just tell me the limitation, you also want to say how you tried to mitigate it, or maybe why it's not as problematic as it initially looks. I see this all the time where many people say, here are 10 limitations in my paper. We didn't do this, we didn't have this data wasn't available. And gosh, by the time I end up reading the paragraph, I'm like, that's a lot of limitations. Maybe I don't want to read this. What you want to do instead is say, we used Medicare claims data, which may not be generalizable to the broader population of patients who are not on Medicare. That's a very fair limitation. But you might add right after that and say, to mitigate that, we chose procedures that are most common amongst Medicare beneficiaries, making them the most relevant group. So try to put some context in about why that limitation maybe isn't as harsh as it initially sounds when you read it. And then finally, I think this is the fun paragraph, implications moving forward. So what do you want people to do? People have read the article, they've read the findings, they believe you, they think you've added something new, you've been clear about your limitations, but people are still really compelled. Like, what do you want them to do? Do you want them to go vote for this new policy? Do you want them to change their clinical practice? Do you want them to start collecting data differently? This is your time to really kind of call for action to advance your work forward. I want to close and say something about sort of the process of writing, and I hope that you appreciate the process. In our kind of convention, we think of at least 5 different stages of a manuscript, from coming up with a good research question, doing some of the troubleshooting and analysis, figuring out what's the story, why do people care about this, how are we going to talk about these findings, creating tables and figures, and actually writing. Those are pretty overwhelming to do all of those, especially if this is your first time writing a paper. And I think about it a lot in the same way that we think about how we teach surgery. In surgery, we train in general surgery, which is my specialty, for 5 to 7, sometimes 8, 9 years. And this is one of the operations that we do pretty commonly. It's removing the gallbladder, cholecystectomy. And even in this operation, that's one of the most common things we do. We learn it as early as our first year of training. There are more than 35 decision trees that you have to make during that operation. And we certainly wouldn't ask a first year surgical trainee or resident to just do this operation by themselves. We give them a little part of the operation to do and then train them on the others. And as they progress further, give them more of the operation to do. In other words, graduate independence or graduate into autonomy. We think of a similar process for ourselves here in terms of how we teach manuscript writing. So for someone's first project, I really don't want them to come up with a brand new research question, do the whole analysis, come up with a narrative, tables and figures, and write the whole paper. One, then why do they need me if they can do all that by themselves? But 2, they just may not be ready for that. And I think as mentors, it sometimes is a shame to overwhelm a mentee by giving them too much to bite off and discouraging them from the work. So on our first project, I tend to do the majority of the research question analysis and narrative up front, and I take the mentee through just the writing. And if they can get through all the steps, writing and learning the conventions, putting things in the right order, and then start giving them progressively more autonomy. It's a little different for every mentee and every project, and some mentees may come in ready for a level 3 project. Some mentees may struggle and stay in level 1 for a number of projects, but all that to say, try to have some sort of system of graduated autonomy to get your writing to its highest level. With that, I'll say thank you for your time. That's my email and contact information, and that website is where the written guide to this talk will be if you want to reference that as well. And thanks for your time. Hope it was helpful to you.